Good evening, everyone. We are continuing to work our way through In Divine Friendship, letters by Swami Kriyananda. And I hope you're enjoying it. I say this about every book of Swami's that I do. It's been so interesting. So I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to raise our consciousness, that we may perceive your world as you created it, a divine opportunity for each one of us to come to know ourselves as we truly are, one with your infinite spirit. Guide us through our fears and our delusions, that we may emerge from the shadows into the light. Everything we seek, Lord, will be found in deepening our relationship with Thee. Awaken us, bring us home. Om, peace. Amen. We'll start.
Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart's song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. 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 Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. Listen to my soul song. Listen to my heart song. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. In secret in my soul, I will gather blossoms for thee, dipping them in devotion. I will lay them at thy feet. I will lay them at thy
Om peace. Amen. Well, my friends, we are in the section called Yoga and Christianity, and it goes on certainly through this evening. Let me just give a glance here. No, it's rather a long section, so let's see what happens. We are in a letter that's written November 3rd, and it is a follow-up to the previous letter. Let's see. Somebody had asked Swamiji in the year 2000, do you consider yourself at Ananda basically Hindu or a mixture of faiths and traditions? In the last class, we went through that whole letter, and now this one is simply a follow-up. So it's more of the same to the same person. So Swami writes, I believe that this was, I believe this was from somebody outside the community. I don't think this was a letter from a devotee, but it was from someone else, but I'm honestly not certain. Swami writes, again, I want to emphasize that what we teach is not a mixture of anything. I say this because I know this is the concern of modern Catholic theologians. It is a teaching essential to all religions. That is, it addresses their essence. Much could be said on the subject if you're interested in pursuing it. So this is an issue that is not obvious. The intensity with which Swami answers this question is not something that's obvious to sort of the man on the street who's just moving along and not thinking deeply. And in fact, there's kind of a trend, it's almost a New Age trend, you might say. When I say New Age, I mean, a lot of my vocabulary is out of date. I have friends who are 2 generations younger than me, and it's really impressive to see what I take for granted and what they don't know, and what they take for granted that I don't know. So I use the phrase New Age, New Thought, which is actually left over from the 70s, when a whole lot of revolutionary different ideas were coming through in the spiritual world. And there was a whole series of programs that went on for several years, which was called the Meeting of the Ways, and all these different representatives of different spiritual traditions would come together. And then a lot of time, people, in that movement began to think, this was not like official, but they began to think, well, I'll take a little from here and a little from there, and I like this idea, and I'll take a little of that ritual and a little bit of this one. And in the name of being ecumenical, which of course there's no reason not to, you just sort of end up practicing a lot of different traditions. And what we're taking, mostly when we're doing that, is we're taking what Swami calls the way of belief, which is we have rituals, we have outer ways, we follow the way of belief. If I'm Jewish, then I do it in Hebrew, and I celebrate on Friday night, And we have these rituals that we sing, and the husband sings the coming of the Sabbath and sings a great tribute to the woman of the household. And if we're Catholic, we go to Mass and we follow these sacraments, and the priest intercedes. If we're Hindu, we have all these rituals that we do. But all of these are outward expressions of some inner commitment. And so they are the ways of belief. And when we start talking like that, they're all different from each other. The Jews do it in Hebrew, the Hindus do it in Sanskrit, the Catholics used to do their story in Latin. Everybody has their own different way, and you can respect each other. And what happens is everybody gets together and really appreciates each other's rituals. And as I was saying, maybe, this week I'll do this, and next week I'll do that, because I like them all. But what we have is a synthesis. What we have is a combination. And Swami makes an emphasis, and I've already talked about this in this section. The way of belief is all these outer rituals, and you can never make them come together, because the Jews want to speak Hebrew, the Hindus want to speak Sanskrit, the Roman Catholics want to speak Latin, and it's fundamental to what they're doing. You can like each other, you can not hate each other for it, you can trust each other, but you can't reconcile it on the way of belief. However, on the way of awakening, we're talking about the inner transformation that takes place either because of our own direct attunement or as a result of the way of belief that I'm following, my conformance in my practice of these particular rituals and rites and dogmas. If I do them with my whole heart, mind and strength and soul, then I begin to change inside. My consciousness expands, my love, my patience, my compassion, my perspective on what's important and what isn't important, my capacity to love, my perception of God's hand behind my life, my feeling of belonging to a greater reality, my awareness of the oneness of all creation. So the ways of belief are always separate, but the ways of awakening is when our realities can finally begin to merge, because our consciousness expands and we all see things differently, and we all perceive the same reality. So when Swami's asked here, what we teach is not a mixture of anything. It's not like the fact that Jesus is on our altar and also Krishna is on our altar, meaning that we're a little Hindu and a little Catholic and we do a little of this and a little of that, because what Master came to teach is the way of awakening. And that's why the fundamental practice that Master teaches is how to work with your inner energy. Now, yoga and Master's teaching of self-realization works explicitly with the inner energy, and that's what gives it power. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks of, the superior path is the most efficacious path, the most effective path is the path of yoga. And he doesn't mean that my Hindu path of yoga. What yoga means is to work directly with the way we are made internally. Work directly. Yoga is the science of awakening. And you don't have to call it yoga. Yoga is just one of the things that it's called. It's the science of awakening, because great Christian saints, Catholic saints like Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, St. Francis, the world they described that they discovered internally is exactly the same world the yogi experiences. And they did not come to it through yoga, they came to it through deep devotion to Jesus. Although, when you get deeply into the way of awakening, the energy rises, it concentrates at the spiritual eye. We have perceptions of reality that we all recognize. So this is where Swami says, what Master taught is what is a teaching that is essential to all religions, which is the way of awakening. The reason that Master brought it is because we are coming out of Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is the age of matter in which separateness, it appears that all the different elements of creation are separate one from another. It's like we literally, during Kali Yuga, we live at the tips of our fingers. We look at the four fingers and it seems obvious that there's separation in space between them. When we move, I'll put my hand so that my wrist is higher because it was more true. As we live into Dwapara, as we move into a higher age, we realize that the four fingers still exist, but their difference is their separateness is superficial because they all emanate from the same hand. They're all animated by the same consciousness. And that's exactly what happens to us as the age advances. So as the age advances, it's more possible, because the perception of the planet is higher, to talk explicitly about where differences resolve into unity instead of just having to defend those differences. Now, we are in a transition age and everything is becoming more polarized. So even as there's a vast movement toward unification on all levels, unification of religious traditions, unification of cultures, of languages, of education, there's simultaneously a desperate effort to keep it all separate. And I've talked about this, but I have to come back to it over and over again. When 30 years ago, more than that now, 35, 40 years ago, when I was really starting out trying to share these teachings beyond our little retreat at Ananda village, but beginning to do a little bit of traveling and talking to other groups. Now let me think just a moment, what was I? Oh yes, and especially when, at the end of, in 87, when I moved from Ananda village to the Silicon Valley and have been involved in the building of this community ever since, I had to really think to myself, what are the essential ideas that someone entering into the Ananda culture really needs to know in order to be able to cohesively understand what's going on here. And there's a few concepts, of course, the way of awakening, the laws of karma, the possibility of reincarnation, a few things like that. But one of them is the yugas. To really understand, that we are in a rising age and the nature of that rising age, because it makes sense out of this world around us. Otherwise, what's going on on our globe right now is incomprehensible, actually. But once we have the whole idea of the yugas there, which is why I mention it so often, there is a wonderful book, and it's called, surprise, The Yugas. And it's published by Crystal Clarity. It's written by two Ananda members, David Steinmetz and Joseph Selby. If you haven't read that, I highly encourage you to get that book and read it, because it really makes the world kind of click into place, and it helps us to understand exactly what's going on. No, this is not a blend. We're going to the heart, the essential heart of spiritual teaching. That's where real unity lies. Master said, self-realization has come to unite all religions. Some of his followers have interpreted that to mean that the self-realization organization is going to be, as Swami said, the Catholic Church of the New Age, but that's not what Master meant. Master meant the principle of self-realization, in other words, the way of awakening. That every individual, no matter what way of belief and ritual they follow, is seeking and will experience the way of awakening, because that's the whole point of it. It's not a matter of just carrying it out as an outward ritual. It's to have it really transform our consciousness. That's why Swami said what Master self-realization is the essence of all spiritual paths. The principle of self-realization Master described as the unifying principle of all spiritual teaching. So we stand at that point of unity, which allows us to be able to understand and, comprehend the intention of Hinduism, the intention of Jesus' teachings. This is how Master put it, the original teachings of Krishna, the original teachings of Jesus. He said his mission from the Himalayan masters, from Babaji, was to teach the original teachings of Jesus, the original teachings of Krishna, and to show that they are the same. And from those two examples, we can extrapolate out to all teachings that are based on Sanatana Dharma, all teachers founded from the same level of revelation. So it's a very important point that Swami makes over and over again, much earlier in this book, when Swami was talking about his book, The Hindu Way of Awakening, which, even though it's about Hinduism, is about it's the principles of exactly what I was saying in much greater detail. During Swami's lifetime, he continually urged our publishing company to organize itself in this way, that each of his books, Swamiji said, had a separate mission and a totally distinct and identifiable audience. And he encouraged the publishing company to organize itself in departments, book by book, so that there could be some individual whose entire creative focus in working for the publishing company was to find the right audience for the book, for example, Out of the Labyrinth, which is out of the labyrinth for those who want to believe but can't. That's what it's called. And Swamiji tries to answer the argument that life is meaningless, and he tries to answer it from the point of view of the way Master taught self-realization. I mean, it's a philosophical book, it's a search for meaning book, it's a science and religion book, how they meet. It has an entirely different audience than, for example, spiritual marriage. Because the book about spiritual marriage is self-evident who that audience is for, but many people who would like to elevate their relationship so that it serves the higher purpose of expanding consciousness may have no interest whatsoever in a book of philosophy teaching you how to believe in God or answering the arguments of science. In fact, it's very interesting. It was simply too big an idea. It required too big a staff. It required an understanding that we just weren't able to rise to. But Swami never gave up on the idea, and he actually put it into his will. He wrote Last Will and Legacy, I believe he called it. But he put into that document that he wanted someday for our publication company to be organized in that rather unusual manner. So earlier in this book, he was talking about the book, The Hindu Way of Awakening, which deals with what I've been talking about. And I started to say it was about Hinduism, but it's really about where does the unity of all, what actually creates the unity of all religions? What we have had for some time among a certain group of people is a great deal of respect for each other, and the belief that merely because this is the path I follow, it doesn't mean there is no other valid path. And that's a big step forward. But Swami wants to move the whole thing to another octave. But in that book, Swami was talking about a very subtle idea. And I'm going back to a much earlier class in which someone became extremely enthusiastic about that book and proposed that we start a theater festival in which all the different religious groups bring theater productions together. And they asserted that it was an idea consistent with Swami's book, The Hindu Way of Awakening. And Swami, rather emphatically, kindly but emphatically said, you've entirely missed the point. Because all that would happen is everybody would come. First of all, it was not a practical idea. But the second thing is that the Christians would come and show why Jesus is the way, the Buddhas would come and show why Buddha was the way, and the Zoroastrians would come, and whatever it is, everybody would demonstrate their way of belief, and that's not at all what Swami wanted. It's a much more subtle point than that, much more subtle. That's why Swami's having this addendum to this whole letter he's already sent. So now we'll go on from there. As for your earlier letter on the subject of openness to other religions, and now he's going back to this conversation he had with the Bishop of Assisi, which we talked about previously, this unfortunate conversation he had with the bishop. Yes, I told the local bishop of Assisi, Italy, Swami's writing from, he was living in Italy at the time. Ananda has a community a little ways out of town of Assisi, Italy. We started in 1980, and our success has attracted unwelcome attention from some of the local Catholic officials who are not fond of us. Yes, I told the local bishop of Assisi, Italy, that I myself love to go to Mass and encouraged our people to do so. I said, and always say, that these Ananda teachings make people better Christians, etc., and that I have never tried to convert people, meaning to convert people away from where they find inspiration. You know, it's not the way of self-realization to go to someone and say, you're following a false teaching, or to say, Jesus Christ is the only Savior, and if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you will be damned to hell. I was hearing someone repeat again, you know, just the things that happen to people once they get down that road, like, and it happens between parents and their children. Until the child accepts Jesus Christ as his own Savior, the poor parents have this thought in their mind that because they have accepted Christ, they will go to heaven for all eternity. But if their child doesn't accept Christ, the child will go to hell, and the parents and the children will be separated for all eternity. Whoa, talk about a little bit of pressure on both sides of that. Savitri, who grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, to loving parents, especially her mom, who really held that belief and was really afraid that her little daughter, her only child, was going to go to hell, and was constantly pushing for her to accept Jesus Christ. Now, this is how Savitri told the story with her little bit of a Memphis accent. She said finally, when she was 10 years old, she went to the altar rail to accept Jesus Christ as her Savior. And she says this is how her internal prayer went. She's kneeling at the altar rail about to be whatever was going to happen to her to prove that she was going to be saved. She said inwardly, Jesus, I have no quarrel with you, but I want you to know I'm only doing this to get my mama off my back. I hope you don't mind. But there it was. I mean, Savitri has given her life deeply and devotedly to God and to Jesus' original teachings. But heavens, what a situation to be in. I read about another child who, part of the teaching, and this is the way of belief, that there's going to be this day of rapture. That they read the New Testament to say that there's just going to be this moment when Jesus is its second coming and he returns, and all those who are saved are going to be swept up into heaven, and those who wasted their lives and did not become disciples of Jesus, I guess, are just going to be left behind. And this poor little child, every time she came home from school, she was terrified that the house would be empty and that everybody in her family would have been taken up on the day of rapture and she would not have been deemed worthy and she would be stuck here all by herself. Oh my gosh. But this is what happens. We set up these definite external realities, then we have to make all the rules that follow from that. And really unfortunate things begin to happen. And you know, it's kind of hard to like take half of that. It's either it is or it isn't. That's why self-realization, as Master teaches it, with our understanding of the gradual expansion of consciousness and all these other things, I find it more comforting. Let's put it like that. So in any way, that's why he said, Swami never tries to convert anyone. He doesn't try to tell you your way is wrong and my way is right. If people are interested, he shares with them. Then you make up your own mind. So Swami says, when I told the bishop that I go to Mass, that I have encouraged other people to go to Mass, it's not that Swami went to Mass every Sunday, but on occasion Swami would go to Mass and find it inspiring. Why not? Especially, this is the year 2000, especially when in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, when all these beautiful European churches, you would go. the bishop's response to me was, shall we say, unsettling. And unsettling, I think, he Swami doesn't explain it here, but the bishop basically thought it was presumptuous of them to go to Mass. How dare you, basically, think that you can come and take the blessings of the Mass when you don't accept all the rest of it. This bishop is very, very conservative. You know, he's on that side of it that was fighting to keep the separateness. So his response to me was, shall we say, unsettling. Then Swami writes, I've never gone to church again, except to meditate in the Portiuncula, nor have I urged anyone else to do so. You know, this is a position Swami finds himself in sometimes where, and this happened also in other contexts, where he would try to be open and supportive and encourage people if they felt to, you know, to participate in various other ways, only to have the authorities in those other ways say things that are very disturbing to people's faith. And that's happened to Swami on more than one occasion. That's what happened here. Because, of course, we were very noticeable in the small town of Assisi. We have a lot of magnetism. We were a lot of Americans, especially at that time, and the people in the clergy, the priests in the area. Assisi is a very small town. The priests knew us, and then when they began to sort of develop this negative attitude toward us, Swami didn't want to subject people to that, especially not our Catholic Europeans. You know, Italians saw no conflict. Swami wasn't raised Catholic, but many of the people in our Assisi center, especially as the years passed, were Italian Catholics. They'd always been Catholics. It was a social family. You know, self-realization became their real spiritual path, but in their own minds, to continue to go to Mass was just perfectly natural because they'd always done so. But if you're going to go to Mass, the priests know that you also go to Ananda, and then the priest began to challenge your view, challenge your spiritual position. Swami felt in good conscience he couldn't put people in that kind of jeopardy, because it could be very confusing to them if the priests that they've always respected, if the bishop that they've always respected is now speaking against what they're doing. So Swami stopped going, and he stopped recommending to others that they go. So that doesn't mean I'm hostile, Swami says to the Catholics. After the earthquake here in 1997, a little village nearby was virtually demolished, and their historic little church was destroyed. I offered to raise the money to build them a temporary chapel, with the suggestion that if and when the little church, really just a chapel, was rebuilt, the one we'd built could be used as a meeting hall or a schoolroom. Swami did raise a lot of money. He was in America and he put on some concerts, and it was called Hope and Homes for Italy, because there had been a very bad earthquake, and Swami raised quite a bit of money. I heard later we had a hard time getting anyone to accept it because we ran into a lot of this. So anyway, Swami makes the suggestion, let's build a temporary church and then use it as a meeting hall. Months later, Swami said, I got a letter from the bishop saying, in effect, on the 18th of this month, it was March 1998, I am scheduled to consecrate a newly constructed temporary chapel in the village of Isola, the village here referred to, which will later be used as a meeting hall once the old church has been rebuilt. Swami just said, great idea. One can't get much of a sound out of only one hand clapping. In other words, Swami had reached out, here's our solution, here's the money I raised in America. You know, the bishop just stonewalled him and then does exactly what Swami suggested, but refused to take his hand, just one hand clapping. It's unfortunately really what happened. Swami goes on, I suspect and have heard that the Catholic Church in America is more open in its attitudes. The church here tries, but there are many factions, and the local bishop is one of the rigid conservatives. So there it is, in divine friendship. I know because I have Catholic friends in this area. I live in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I could be wrong in this, but I believe San Francisco being one of the most liberal cities in America, that they got some very, very conservative priests, and who just started imposing all this rigidity, and various teachers in schools and various things just had to resign because the priest was just insisting on these rigid delineations. So that's just what's going on in our world right now. In one context, this was not the issue. The issue here is different, but it was the question of whether or not Catholics should continue with the celibate priesthood, which is, of course, an ongoing discussion. Swami's comment, and I can't explain it more because in the context he was just being somewhat lighthearted but serious. He said, if the Pope, gives up on a celibate priesthood, he said, it's the end of the Catholic Church. If the Pope doesn't give up on the celibate priesthood, it's the end of the Catholic Church. And then Swami said, I'm very glad I'm not the Pope. Which is just, these issues are irreconcilable on the level of the way of belief. Their only resolution is in the way of awakening. And we're not there yet, but we're on our way. So we'll just live through all of this interesting times. Okay, this next letter was written back in 1988, and it's on responding to dogmatic attitudes. And we're still in Assisi, and we're still talking about the bishop. This went on, it was in the late 80s that this whole thing really came to a crest. We actually had a situation there, I guess it was also in the 80s, late 80s maybe. No, it was later, it was in the 90s, maybe even the 2000s, where this really mentally unbalanced person filed a lawsuit against Ananda in Italy. A man who made a habit of suing people. He'd sued all the members of his own family and so on, but it got a little traction for a while, and part of the people pushing it along were some of the very priests who weren't keen on us. Eventually the whole thing was resolved, and it was resolved in a category that doesn't exist in American justice. There's a category in Italy that is more than innocent. It's not just you're not guilty as charged. It says there was no basis for this lawsuit ever. It was completely without grounds ever, nothing. So that was how it was finally resolved. But in the middle, there was a certain amount of distressing participation in ways that we wish there hadn't been. This was all some years ago, so I think it's all water under the bridge now. So Swami says, on responding to dogmatic attitudes, this was in January of 1988, Swami says, I am deeply concerned about the remarks of the Bishop of Assisi. I don't think it will suffice to gloss over his reaction to us by telling him once more that people who come to us become better Catholics, which is sort of the argument. What Swami's doing here is, okay, this is something that happened regularly through the course of Ananda, not frequently, but it did happen, where Swami just had enough understanding I would say, from his own intuition and from his many past lives as a king. He just understood how political and religious and sectarian, secular authority all just interplayed. Swami just had a complete, he just had a monarch's attitude about how the forces would play together. On one or two occasions, when we didn't really talk about politics. He was not really interested in politics per se. He was in this world to change consciousness, and changing prime ministers just didn't compare to actually changing consciousness. But I remember one particular, and it was just an offhand remark, and this is not a statement. I know the Israeli-Palestinian dispute has a whole lot of repercussions, so I'm not really talking about that per se. But there was a tone. It was after probably what they would call the 7-Day War, when Israel, this is like in the 60s, I think, when Israel captured the Golan Heights. And I've only been to Israel in the last few years and realized how tiny the country is. And the Golan Heights are these hills that, when they were in the hands of people who were and antithetical, they were anti-Israel, it just gave them a perspective from which they could just shoot all the people for a wide distance in Israel. So at a certain point in one of the conflicts, Israel took possession of the Golan Heights. And then there was diplomatic movements to try to force them to give the Golan Heights back. And I just remember the way Swami commented, just like this: oh, Israel should never give up the Golan Heights. No matter what, they should never give them up. Obvious statement, but Swami said it as if he was sitting at the table, as if he was, the king or the prime minister or the president of whatever country was going to make that decision. And his point of view on it was from that level of experience. And in this situation with the Sisi and the bishop, there's some letters in here, but I know what isn't printed here. Swami was constantly instructing some of our leaders in Italy that they needed to not be so naive about this. They weren't going to just, as he put it, you're not going to charm the bishop. You're not going to show him that we're so nice and we're going to change his mind. Swami really understood how commitment and sectarianism and power plays itself out. When in 1976, that's what it was, when Ananda village was the only Ananda there was, and we had operated under the radar of the planning department and the building department in that county because we had been designated in 1968 or 69 a church camp. We were put under the only government official that we had to please at that time was the health inspector. The health inspector was a wonderful man named Hal Cox, and Hal Cox had served all over the world, and he'd served in places that were highly undeveloped, where the financial resources were extremely limited. And he could tell the difference between that which was unsafe and that which was simply extremely simple or primitive. And so we were allowed to develop for the first 10 years, just as long as we pleased the health officer. As long as Hal Cox was pleased, we were legal and we were fine. And as long as we were sanitary and safe, he didn't bother with the endless numbers of codes and rules and things that have become the way of life at that point. And it was entirely God's grace, because if we had been forced to conform to all those codes from the beginning, we never could have gotten off the ground. But because that's all we had to meet, we could operate without indoor plumbing. We could just have outhouses, and you just got your water from a water tap and carried it into whatever you were living in that just kept the rain off. Little trailers, little sheds basically put together, even using just plastic instead of wood over wood struts. I mean, we could do anything as long as we were safe and sanitary, which we were, because we're refined people. That was not hard to do. But then gradually the planning department caught up with us and realized that we had way outstripped the church camp designation, but we were grandfathered in because we'd done the only thing that was asked of us. We hadn't broken the laws. It's just they hadn't kept up with what we were doing. But the planning director at that time had risen through the ranks, had no real formal training, and we were just too complex a problem, and she simply had no idea what to do with us. And she had a very bureaucratic mentality, and therefore it's when you're the bureaucrat and somebody asks you for something, you just say no, and you just keep saying it until the person goes away. And Swami perceived very quickly that this planning director would never let us do anything, that she would just keep stonewalling us until she believed we would go away, which many people would have. They would have just given up. So he saw the only solution was to get her fired. And the fact of the matter was, there'd been a grand jury investigation about her incompetence, and it had been recommended that she be fired. But the Board of Supervisors wasn't acting on that recommendation. So Swami started this political activism campaign, and he swept me up into it. It was started in late 75 and went through 76, which was the 200th anniversary of America. So Swami called our little movement the Bicentennial Liberty Committee, which was so much fun. But many people at Ananda were really nervous about it. And they just kept thinking we could charm her into agreeing with us. But Swami saw that she presented a mortal threat to the future of Ananda's development. And he just went right to the end of the story. He just didn't bother with any of the futile efforts. She had just made herself clear. Swami had the same perception about this bishop. This bishop, Swami recognized who he was, what his commitments were, and what he really thought. And there's just no way we're going to persuade this man. And that wasn't popular, because we were naive children in many ways, we just didn't understand, as Swami did. So he says, again, I'm deeply concerned about this bishop, and I don't think by telling him that people who come to us become better Catholics is a really good strategy. In many cases they do, in that we don't convert people away from the church. No harm in saying those things because they are true. However, we've said them already, and the bishop is reacting as though we hadn't spoken. Somebody's just pointing it out. Look, guys, we've been saying this for a while. It's true, we can keep saying it, but it has had no effect on this man. And this is a powerful man. He's reacting as though we hadn't spoken. I think he is getting heavy energy from the priest in San Presto. San Presto was the small village that was closer to us than Assisi. It's a pity I never went to see that man, Swami says. Swami went to the bishop but never went to that priest. I think also that we must take this as something God has sent us. A test, certainly, but one that can strengthen us if we meet it with faith and good cheer. See, our approach had been, since we had arrived in Assisi, and at the beginning it worked. We just, kind of were the new kids in town and went and introduced ourselves to everyone and talked about what fun we were going to have together. And, and at first it had worked because we'd met some open-minded priests and they saw in us fellow devotees. Because, of course, many people are like that. We used to take these pilgrimage trips to India with 30 Americans, and one of the places we would go was to the Missionaries of Charity, which is Mother Teresa's religious order, and in the city of Calcutta is where she had her headquarters, and we would go visit her. I met Mother Teresa maybe 3 or 4 times. We started going in 1987 and went almost every year for a while. And at one of our very first visits, we wanted to introduce ourselves very quickly, so we sang for her. We sang perhaps even a few songs from the oratorio and just a few other devotional songs, because that seemed to us like the fastest way to share from the heart. And she got to know us. And so each year when we would come, one year when we were there, she leaned over to one of her sisters and said, "We should pray for these people. They come every year and they love God very deeply." And it was just so touching. Of course, she works in India. She's more broad-minded, and she was a saint. But yes, we do love God, and we come every year. I mean, that also happened. But these authorities, it was quite something else. So this is a test, and so we just assumed friendship, but we were meeting with real serious antagonism. It is important, I think, Swami says, not to lose our own inner center when dealing with this matter. By that he meant was, don't try too hard. don't think that if you just say it again in a new way, or, show how just broad-minded and supportive you are. I've seen people do this. You actually begin saying things that are not quite sincerely true in an effort to sort of build a bridge. And this is what he meant. Don't lose your inner center. Be careful. Speak the truth, and don't try too hard to win them over. We can lose it if we assume too much of an attitude of wanting to reassure the bishop and that local priest. I think we are going to have to be strong in ourselves and in our inner convictions. We know that what they're saying to us is wrong. To try to tell us that, we don't understand what we're doing spiritually, or that their way is better, or that Master was wrong about what he was doing. I know in this context I told you about the Protestant minister in town here from whom we rented his church one year before we had our own for a big celebration. And when I told him that Master taught, Paramahansa Yogananda taught from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, he said to me just like this, "Well, he doesn't presume to be a Christian, does he?" And I just said, he absolutely does. I mean, how dare you say such a thing as that? You don't own Jesus just because you have a title. I mean, I wasn't angry, but I absolutely refused to give him that. I said, he draws it directly from Jesus, not from any church. And of course, that wasn't what that man wanted to hear, but it was the truth, and I wasn't going to be shaken from it just by his presumption. That's what Swami's talking about. Now, we can be sweeter, we can be silent, but we shouldn't try to create some sort of level of understanding. Not at this point. After everything has been tried, as Swami said, you've already told him all this, and he acts as if we're not speaking. We haven't spoken. So nothing's going to change if you say the same thing again. These men are showing us who they are and what they believe, and now we have to behave accordingly. Just like Swami in the early 80s felt that planning director had shown us who she was and what she believed and what she intended to do, and we had to act accordingly. We couldn't just be naive. That's what he's saying here. We can lose it if we assume too much of an attitude of wanting to reassure the bishop and that local priest. I think we are going to have to be strong in ourselves and in our inner convictions. It is possible this thing will build up into determined persecution of us. This is, Master made that comment, that there could come a time when self-realization will be persecuted by the Catholics. And we haven't seen it, but Swami knows it's there. But the more we stand our own ground, instead of trying to meet them on theirs, the less they will be able to touch us. In other words, also, we don't want to just give them lots of ammunition. We don't want to sort of be stretching our own point of view and trying to build, saying things that aren't quite true, that then later we sort of have to repudiate. Plus we give an impression of weakness, and we create a vibration of trying too hard. Just be loving, kind, but just stand where we stand. After all, Swami writes, the communists, the Masons, and any number of groups are actively hostile to the Catholic Church and have been able to hold their ground. He's saying even if they do take a stand against us, not everybody in Italy kowtows to the Catholic Church. Some of them just stand up for themselves, and they're allowed to do that. We are in no way hostile. In fact, we deeply appreciate all that the Church has done. Virtually, we are in their camp. The difficulty is that though our very similarity, the difficulty is that through our very similarity to them and openness to them, they may be able to strike at us. See, this is where Swami again has this very, he knows history, and he also knows governance. He knows how power plays against itself. It's not cynical, he's just seen it. So when we were engaged in 12 years of litigation with the other spiritual masters, other spiritual organization. Swami just always knew how it was going to play out. When we were engaged in that Bicentennial Liberty Committee, when we were working with trying to incorporate Ananda Village as a California city, Swami just understood. He just understood how energies play together. And Swamiji also has said he has a gift for seeing where things are going to go. From where we are now, he can see where it's going to unfold. Experience, intuition, wisdom, all of those things. So he says, our very similarity and openness to them, they may be able to strike at us. He doesn't explain it more than that, but he puts it like that. It is important not to try to speak their language. That is to say, not to enter into the sort of dialogue where we hope to persuade them of the deep ties we feel with them. This is again Swami just saying, don't try too hard, don't step out of your reality too much. It's too bad, it is too bad, he said, but they have developed their arguments over centuries, to the point where if we try to speak their language, we will find the doors of logic utterly closed to us. He's speaking to our naivete. We just think that, I'll just explain it and they'll just be happy like us. I remember during those litigation years, to a lesser extent, in the other things I was in, the municipality and the Bicentennial Liberty, but really during the litigation, I just realized that it didn't matter how nice I was, how logical I was, how much I tried. The other side was not going to change their point of view. And they were not going to hear my very logical, well-meaning arguments. They were not going to respond to my sweetness. In fact, anything that sort of tried to be reconciliation was perceived as weakness. Every time we tried to reconcile, they tried to exploit it. That's also what Swami means. Oh, look, these people are, they're trying to be nice to us, and they would exploit it, thinking we were trying to abandon our point of view. That's what Swami's talking about here also. But we weren't. But Swami says they've had centuries to hone their arguments. These bishops and priests are completely convinced of their point of view. They're not waiting to hear a new point of view. Naive is the word I've used before. It's folly to think that we're going to persuade them. They will try to force us to use their definitions, their theological language, and to reason according to their premises. Meaning, how can you be a Catholic? This Swami had this conversation with the bishop. How can you call yourself a Christian if you don't do X, Y, Z? And X, Y, Z are the Catholic's definition of what it means to be devoted to Jesus. And they'll just argue, and Swami says elsewhere that's exactly what happened. He calls himself a Christian, and the priest, the bishop, just scoffed at him and just declared it was impossible, just like that Protestant minister did with me. Yogananda doesn't presume to call himself a Christian, does he? Because I know what it means to be a Christian, and he doesn't follow that criteria. Therefore, he is not a Christian. And Swami says, you'll never get anywhere. They've had centuries to argue it out. And he says, in their own field, they reign supreme. You just can't get through to them. Their weak point, I love this, their weak point is they're talking to themselves. They're not really talking to the people around them. They're just talking to themselves, and that's the way it is. We have no choice but to leave them there while following our own lines of reasoning. Silence, not reasoned argument, is, I think, our strongest force at present, until such time as a few of them show a willingness to speak with us in a shared language. The bishop is obviously incapable of doing so, has no desire to do so, and almost certainly is unaware that any language but his own even exists. Love Swami. He had to write that very strongly because in the midst of all of this, there were a few people who kept running back to the bishop and trying to make friends. And Swami thought it was not only futile, he actually thought it was dangerous. Because what happens is then the bishop tries to win that person over, tries to separate him from the rest of us. We saw that in the litigation years and in other things we'd done. He really wanted us to stand strong. He was also trying to prepare us. If this gets a lot worse, what's really going to work? We had a tiny little, I shared this story, I believe, in this series, but I'll tell it again here. We had a tiny little experience of this when we were on pilgrimage in Israel just before the pandemic. So that would have been January of 2019, I guess. Or 2020. It was January of 2020, actually. Really? It was just a year ago? 2 years ago. It must have been 2019. 2020? Really? Okay, amazing. My friend Ekavir, who was with us there, tells me it was just then. Yeah, I guess it would have been because we would have been there in January. Oh, it's a half a year past January almost. That's where the time goes. It's been a year and a half. We were at this Franciscan monastery where there was this cave that was inhabited by John the Baptist, and there were 40 of us, and we did 2 pilgrimages, and the second one was all devotees from India. And it was the second pilgrimage. There were 40 of us. We completely filled this cave all the way back to the door. And we had a harmonium with us, or maybe it was an electric keyboard. And one of the Indian guides, one of the Indian leaders, Shurjo, was playing the keyboard, and he was chanting in Hindi, one of Master's chants that had been translated into Hindi. He was all the way in the back, and so he was right by the open door. And he was very energetic in the way he was chanting, and all of the Indian devotees were chanting in Hindi like this. And all of us, we were just about to meditate, and I was sitting right next to him in the doorway. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting on the floor, and this very big man, who I believe was a priest, is standing in the doorway. And he says, let me think, he basically says, we were just about to meditate, the chanting stopped. He comes in and he says, "This is a Christian monastery," like that. And I just, without any thought, in this little girl's voice, I said, "We're here for Jesus," like that. And then he says, like, "This is a Christian monastery. We were about to meditate." And then I say again, "We're here for Jesus," like that. And it's sort of like, there wasn't much he could do to me. And he sort of said something like, "Humph, humph, I hope so," and then wandered off. I mean, it was just so absurd, the whole thing. But there it was. He had to protect his turf. Oh, my. Anyway, so everywhere you go. Master said, ignorance is pretty much evenly distributed all around the world. Nobody has a what do you call it? Nobody has a monopoly on it. The first time we were, or one of the first trips when we were in India, there was this wonderful man named Sanjay Arora, who was our travel escort, and over the course of 30 and 40 years, he helped us with countless trips in India and was our guide, and then eventually he had his own company and he helped us all through it. And the first year we went to Puri, which is on the coast of India, and it's a very sacred, one of the holiest places in India to Hindus. And there's a big temple there called the Jagannath Temple, and it's very, very orthodox. And our Sanjay at that point himself, I think he was 24 years old. He was just starting in his own life as an agent for Europeans and Americans, taking them through his country. And we got to the Jagannath Temple, and we all wanted to go into the Jagannath Temple, but we couldn't go in because we weren't Hindus. However that's defined, we didn't match. Sanjay knew and said it, very strongly, that we were the most devoted to God group he'd ever seen, and that we seemed to know more about his true Hinduism than he did. We didn't know the details, but he was just astonished that anybody would not let us, of all people, into that temple. And so he determined to sort of carry it out. And he went and spoke to the board of directors, whoever they were. But after his little foray, and he was a very forceful and intelligent man, he came back and he said, never in 100 million years are they going to let you in that temple. He said, absolutely not. They just are absolutely not going to let you in. And you know what's fun? The so-called missing years of the life of Jesus, the 18 years that were missing, it's become common knowledge, but Master Strong, asserted that Jesus spent those years in India, in Egypt, in Persia, but most of the time he spent in India. He went to the Himalayas, into the area that's now Tibet. He went to Varanasi, which was an ancient seat of learning, even the time of Jesus. Varanasi is the oldest continuously inhabited city, perhaps, in the world. Same culture. I mean, times change, but it's always been devoted to Sanatana Dharma. Jesus went to Varanasi, and Jesus went to the Jagannath Temple in Puri. But he clashed with the narrow-minded Orthodox priests, and his life was in danger, and he actually had to flee. So it's apparently always been that way. So you have Catholics, you have bishops. It's whenever I talk about the story of Jesus and the Easter story and how Jesus was arrested and so on, and people tell the story that, quote, the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, and a lot of really horrible things have happened because of that. But the fact of the matter is, Jesus was a Jew, and pretty much all his disciples were Jews. The whole thing was a Jewish reality. So the people who were for Jesus were Jews, and Jesus never stopped being a Jew. That was the context in which the whole drama took place. And the people who also were against him and engineered his crucifixion were also Jews, but they weren't Jews. They were a corrupt priesthood. They were a prejudicial, corrupt priesthood who were using the power that they had to enrich themselves and to give themselves importance. And that doesn't matter. You take whatever label is available to you, but it's the inner state of awakening, or the lack of that. That is the entire issue. It's not your beliefs. It's where your consciousness vibrates. So many people who are devoted Hindus or devoted Buddhists or devoted Sufis or whatever you are, devoted Jews, they recognize each other when they meet because they're all on the same vibration. Because the process, whatever path they're following, the process of inner awakening has brought them together. When we were traveling in Israel on those same trips, we met this wonderful man in the town of Sfat, which is where a lot of scholars go, and it's the center of the study of the Kabbalah, which is the mystical, a mystical branch of Judaism. We met this man who, as it happened, he was an American who had gone to settle in Israel approximately the same time that I and others came to Ananda, but we just recognized each other. And we were just soul brothers and sisters just at one glance. His entire context was different, but we all understood things in the same way. There was no question about it. Didn't matter what words we used. We followed different ways of belief, but we were having the same experience of inner awakening. And it was self-evident as soon as we met. It was a love feast. It was great fun. So, now let's see where we are. Okay, that was the end of that whole letter. So I think we might be out of Assisi and the Assisi bishop at this point. Let's see where we go next. Let's see what happens. Okay, this letter was written in the late 1980s, about the same time as the other. Advice to someone writing an article on the spiritual teachings of East and West. I was happy to get your letter and the article you wrote for your congregation. So perhaps this was written by one of our friends who was a Christian priest, but I'm not sure. I really don't know who. It might have been written by, there were two men who were both practicing active Episcopal priests. They both had churches, and they were also self-realizationists, and they were also Kriyabans. It was a very nice. So because the article you wrote for your congregation implies that they were trying to build a bridge, but I'm not sure about that, to whom this was from. Your article was interesting, but may I suggest another emphasis? The Vedantic view of reality is really only for those very few who are deeply versed in the furthest subtleties of Hindu thought. The Vedantic view is that this world is a dream, and that everything in this world is really an illusion, and that there is only one reality. Now, that is the underlying principle behind Sanatana Dharma, but as Swami's suggesting here, it's not necessarily the first thing you want to say to people, because it takes great strength of mind to really follow that way, that path, everything in us. So the ways of bhakti, of devotion, of service, where we work with reality as we perceive it and don't exert so much effort to reject the common sense experience that we have, but strive first to spiritualize the experience we're already having, and then through that we can perceive things on a deeper and deeper level. Because, maybe the starting point isn't to say, the world doesn't really exist as you say, as you think it does, so behave accordingly. Because most people say, what? What? Really? You just don't know what to do with that. So Swami says, the Vedantic view of reality is really only for those very few who are deeply versed in the furthest subtleties of Hindu thought. Few spokesmen, even for Hinduism, would be able to relate to this division between communion and union as you have described it. Most would be more comfortable with communion than with union. And this is where this comes up all the time. When Orthodox Christians start, let me think how to say this. Because the basic premise of self-realization is not merely that we love God, but that ultimately we merge, we become one with God. So we go, just as he says, communion is the joy that you feel, the love that you feel, coming into you from the divine, flowing through you to others as the divine love. But there's still this world as we experience it. We commune with God in nature, we commune with God in music, we commune with God in the love we feel for those who are close to us or for mankind in general. So we're communing with the divine everywhere. The Vedanta ideal says all that communion is really just a delusion, an illusion and a delusion that has to be overcome. We have to eventually understand that I am one with God and God is everything, and all of this world around me has to be rejected by the discrimination, the jnanic practice of neti, which means not this, this is not eternally real, this is not eternally real, until we get down to that oneness. So this person was writing an article talking about, Christianity proposes communion, but Hinduism proposes union. Swami says it's not a winning argument. It's hard to understand, and it's not attractive. And if you're trying to draw people into this idea, maybe we should start with something that they can understand and they might want. That sometimes you hear, I have heard, Christians talk about just that it gets complicated because all they can imagine is annihilation. And I can't imagine it. It's very hard to figure out. Swami has said this on one occasion at least. He said, when you merge with God and you realize that there is only one reality, He said, for a moment you feel intensely lonely. He said, and then that passes and you feel overwhelmed with bliss. Now, that to me is just, I'm just listening to Swami when he says that, but isn't that so interesting? You feel intensely lonely. And Swami's actually talking about that as an experience. And when we contemplated the idea that I'm going to lose my individuality and there's only one reality, that does not sound attractive to a lot of people. And this is what Swami's trying to get across. Most would be more comfortable with communion than with union. And even if they recognize Vedanta as expressing the highest truth, their concern is with more immediate realities, which can be conceived primarily in dualistic terms. Duality, the I-thou relationship with God. Communion versus union, as he's saying. The real difference between West and East lies in the more active outward emphasis in Western teachings, as opposed to the more passive seeming, because inward emphasis in Eastern teaching. The Westerner is not so much inclined to commune with his neighbor as actively to reach out and share with him or serve him. The Easterner is more inclined to commune with him inwardly. The Western emphasis is on doing, the Eastern on deepening one's sense of being. So don't deal with the Vedantic issue. If you want to make the contrast, the East thinks in terms of the consciousness, the West thinks in terms of the activity. And this is why, even in our Festival of Light, it says, Jesus appears to the great master Babaji, and Jesus says to Babaji, the lights on the high altar of divine communion in my churches burn low, though still lit on the lower altar of good works. The noble taper of inner communion burns low and is ill-attended. Let us together, united in Christ's love, set lights ablaze on that high altar once again. In other words, we need the inward dimension. It's not enough to serve your fellow man. We also have to deepen, well, here we come back to it, don't we? Our inner awakening. We have to understand, what we're doing from an inward level. The orientation, so to speak, of the East has always been to the state of consciousness. And then service and devotion, all of that can follow, but it's the state of consciousness that we're developing, the way of awakening, and not just the way of belief. We take care of the poor, we work with the downtrodden and underprivileged, all to the good, but the purpose of it is to awaken our inner consciousness. The time has come in the evolution of civilization for these two ideals to be united. That's what's happening. Incidentally, when I was studying the New Testament in Greek at college, our professor pointed out that the true meaning of love thy neighbor as thyself is love thy neighbor for he is like you. In a Vedantic rendition would be love thy neighbor. He is a manifestation of thy greater self. So Swami's just taking, it's not just that you love your neighbor, it's that you perceive in everyone else the same expression of divine consciousness that you feel in yourself. And this is a much more subtle, inward way of bringing these points of view together. Swami then saying, thanks for writing and blessings to you in divine friendship. So, my friends, I think that's what we'll do for this evening. And we'll continue with we have a few more. We probably have, yes, looks like we're going to be on yoga and Christianity for another week or two. So, God bless you, my friends.